I'd like to introduce John, who needs no introduction. John Wheeler.
Thank you. I'm going to start off with a real short science review just to get everyone on the same page. We know that our bodies are made up of cells. It turns out that our bodies are made up of trillions of cells, and nearly all of those cells contain DNA in the nucleus. If you looked at the nucleus of a cell in our body, we would have this distinctly shaped, kind of X-shaped thing. That's the form that a chromosome takes during one stage in the cell's lifetime. And that's composed of a packed together strand of DNA. That's composed of a strand of DNA that's packed in there, wound up. If we uncoiled that DNA, it would look more like this, the familiar double helix that a lot of us have seen. And that DNA has, along the rungs, molecules making up the rungs that are abbreviated with C, G, T, or A. Those are for the different molecules that can be used in those rungs. If we read along the side, then we'll be able to get a series of those letters, and that gives the instructions that our body uses in so many different ways. A chunk of DNA that has an identified function is called a gene. So if you have a section of DNA that does something, maybe it makes your hair a little lighter or a little darker or something like that, then we would call that a gene. We have thousands of genes, but if you think about it, compared to the 3 billion molecules, the 3 billion base pairs we have in our genome, a couple tens of thousands of genes is really a pretty small number. And that's partly because the genes are big, and that's also partly because a large amount of our DNA isn't made up of genes. Genes only make up a small fraction of our DNA. These chromosomes floating in our cells in the nucleus are free-floating, and of course they don't have little tags on it to say, like, this is chromosome 6 or something like that. So how do we tell them apart? Well, now we can look at their genes, but originally scientists could only tell them apart at first by length. So they ordered them by length. And if you line them up, kind of turn this diagram sideways, and you can see that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. That's because you get one chromosome from dad and one chromosome from mom. So for any given number, let's say 14, you have 2 there. So if we put this on its side, it would look kind of like this. And this is the familiar way the genome is represented for those of us who've got a genetic ancestry test. The colors designate different areas of ancestry as identified by mutations that match up with certain reference populations, like a bunch of Italians all have a certain mutation. If you have that mutation in that place, they'll color it a shade of blue for Italian. And that gives us an ancestry breakdown like this. So we can see this is mostly European because the blue shades are European. So with that, we'll go on to the love letters the letters of love in our DNA. So where to start? It turns out we've got a lot of letters of love in our DNA from our ancestors, and an awful lot of ancestors. So I'm going to cover only a very, very tiny fraction. We have to pick and choose to talk about it. So I'll start with my grandfather. My grandfather loved his family. He worked day after day, week after week, rivet after rivet on the assembly line at Ford Motor Company to support his family, his wife, son, and daughter. He never knew his daughter's son because he died a couple years before I was born. But I have to think, if he had the opportunity to meet me, to say something to me, I'm sure he'd want to do that. Wouldn't it be neat if I could have a letter of love from him, as he, I'm sure, would have wanted to write? Well, I do have something close. Here's a genome that's representative of me and my sisters, and if I took a look at this, we were able, with family history and by comparing our genomes with my mom and others, to identify these sections as being from him. This is DNA I have from my grandfather. It's a reminder of the letter of love from him, and in that way, I do still feel that connection. And of course, he got that DNA, from his parents, and so on back. And so it's worth taking just a minute to take a look at how many ancestors we actually have. It's easy to forget. If we take a look at this, we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and the numbers double every generation back. If you do a little math, it's just 2 raised to the power of a generation. You see how fast these numbers go up. They go up past thousands of ancestors only a couple centuries back, the time of Thomas Jefferson, say. And if you go beyond that, they go up into the millions and the billions. Because of that, all of us here are descended from nearly everyone who lived in Europe a couple thousand years ago. And if we go beyond that, almost everyone on Earth who lived several thousand years ago. For many of us, that includes Native Americans. That certainly includes pyramid builders. That certainly includes people who built Stonehenge. We can draw from all of those ancestors. All of those ancestors looked on their children, maybe not all, but almost all, looked on their children with love, and a lot of them thought about us, the future generations to come. For all of them, if their lives hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here today. If they hadn't met who they met, if they hadn't survived. For me, that makes me remember that every minute is a priceless, improbable gift that I get to have. It also reminds me that these lives were often hard. We live today better than kings and queens lived when our great-grandparents were born. There's a lot of ways to look at this, a lot of examples, but I'll just mention one that will make it quite clear. Just think back. Think back to the last significant time we needed medical or dental care. The last time we needed significant medical or dental care. And then imagine that same thing happening a century or 2 ago. Ouch, right? Scary stuff. That's what life was like. In a lot of ways, it was very difficult. Violence, too. If we look at things like crime, war, and torture, a lot of different times in history, they were a lot worse than what we have today. For instance, if we take a look at all the different methods of torture, some of them are truly gruesome mutilations and all kinds of pain. War and crime, too, were rampant at times. If you'd like a fascinating glimpse into this aspect of our ancestors' lives, I highly recommend the book, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. I got it on audio and listened to it in the car. Didn't have to take time out of my day reading the book. Fascinating book. I'd sometimes find myself sitting in the car at my destination. Oh no, I gotta get out of the car. You know how that goes with a good audio book. And I need to be clear that by ancestor, I mean both biological ancestors and those who contributed to our world, to ourselves, to our lives. There's a lot of people like that too. Looking at those ancestors of both kinds, I realize this mountain of love that we stand on. This mountain of love, this mountain of struggle, this mountain of triumph. And I think to myself, wouldn't it be good if there were some way that I could thank them? I realized a while ago, when I realized what was behind our ancestry, that I had the opportunity, the rare opportunity, to actually physically thank 2 ancestors. 2 ancestors who actually had contributed quite a bit, most directly, to my life, my parents. And so I wrote them letters, thanking them for everything I could think of. Letters of love and gratitude for their lives, for everything I had, my abilities, and so on. I found that the emotions that this brought up brought me to tears. In fact, you can imagine, I'd write a few pages and I would have to go and recover so I could come back and be able to continue writing. Not a big surprise that they had a similar effect on my parents. It's something that a lot of parents might wait for or think about, and to actually deliver that, it's very moving. Now, of course, my childhood wasn't perfect. No one's childhood is perfect. Our parents are real people living in a real world. I myself might have a stressful day at work and come home sometime and, it gets broken something and maybe I'm a little too harsh. That happens. For those mildly bumpy memories, I encourage you to think for a minute about that memory and see if it's not easy to reinterpret it. Maybe it's something that happened that left you stronger, after all. And I'm not talking about truly horrific stuff. I know that that sometimes happens too, and it's just a matter of healing. But if you have ancestors who still live, I would encourage you to consider writing them letters of gratitude. And perhaps in a strange way, there's another way to thank them. A way that I do often. In fact, every day almost. I'll thank an ancestor or more. I imagine that in all of our ancestors, especially the human ones, especially certain cultures, often venerated ancestors and thought about descendants. All cultures, I think, in some way think about the descendants. I'm sure that there were times back then, plenty of times, millions of times, when some of our ancestors looked at their kids or grandkids with love and thought about the future generations. If I juxtapose that image and the image of me, perhaps in my stone circle in the morning, thanking an ancestor, thinking of a Viking, or thinking of someone in Germany, or any other ancestor all the way back. If I juxtapose those two images, where one's thinking of future generations and expressing love, and the other one is looking back and thanking them with gratitude, isn't that almost like we're communicating? Almost. It feels like it. I feel that connection. And in fact, letters of love aren't read instantaneously, they're opened later. And there's more. After all, I think about ways to pay this back. We can't pay it back. As parents, we know we can't pay it back. We never expect to be paid back by our kids because we've been paid back in advance by our parents. It's kind of a convoluted payback system, but in that way it loops back. So another way for me to feel that I'm paying it back is to pay it forward with love to kids and grandkids and everyone that's going to be in future generations, and to help us build a just, healthy, and sustainable world for all the future web of life. Now, our parents are the nearest of our ancestors, but we have many, many ancestors before that. We can't know all the stories, but we can still imagine them. We can imagine what it was like for a Viking. We can imagine what it was like for a pyramid builder. We can imagine what it was like for my ancestors that fought in the Civil War, or Native ancestors, or the immigrants who came to this country trying to scrap out a life that would allow them to live. If I look at my grandfather's DNA again, this is paying it forward to future generations. If I look at my grandfather's DNA again, I realize that these sections of DNA include genes that allow my eyes to see. They also include some genes that allow me to process language and to talk. I'm using those genes as we talk, his gifts. Wouldn't it be cool if he could see this now? He, of course, inherited those genes from his parents and all the way back. So, where did those incredible genes come from originally? Looking back, we realize that good mutations spread best in a situation of hardship, because otherwise, there's no incentive. If any creature, whether it's got a good mutation or not, can have kids, and they all survive, then there's no selection pressure. There's no reason that those are the genes that are going to win out. And they not only don't spread, but they're usually lost. There's too many examples to count. I've got a lot of them on my Cosmala here, which designates ancestors with clear beads. If I go back in our ancestry to the Neolithic, for instance, I find another reminder of all of these letters of love. Here, on chromosome 2, is a mutation from a G to an A. Back then, 10,000 years ago, our ancestors started to have domesticated animals around. And when a famine hit, and famines hit often back then, any little bit of food could mean the difference between life and death. One of our ancestors had a mutation, that mutation I just mentioned. that allowed them to digest milk even as adults. They had access to more food. And so, their kids could survive. And so that gene could spread through the population, and now most of us here are able to digest milk. We're lactose tolerant. If we go even farther back with that nice memory in our mind of all the good ice cream we get to eat. If we go farther back to our 50,000th great-grandparents, Homo erectus, they gave us genes here that allowed our brains to be much more useful, much bigger, much more capable compared to the brains of chimps. We use those gifts every day. We hold those letters of love. And if we think about them here, on chromosomes 8 and 1 and 16, we realize that these are letters that have a real impact in our daily lives. We skip over billions of ancestors to a time when our ancestor fish clambered onto land. If we take a look at those, we've got some mutations here on 20, allowing fins to be limbs, and on 22, allowing our gills to be reabsorbed and repurposed to become parts of our throat. And even before that, even before we had any life at all on Earth, remember that the atoms other than hydrogen, the atoms including nitrogen and phosphorus that make up the DNA molecule, were forged in the fiery furnaces of ancient supernovas. Those stars, too, are our ancestors. We've seen just a few of these letters of love, and on we move. For me, to connect with these ancestors is to connect with this grand story. To realize that we're their children, and that we're the universe, able to start to understand the first bits of this story in all. And so, I invite you, if you'd like, to join me on a guided meditation. So relax your body, close your eyes, let the cares and concerns of today fall away. It might help to listen to your breathing. We imagine a fog starting at our feet and slowly rising. As the fog rises, this room falls away, and we enter a timeless place. You feel as if you're being lifted up. You feel yourself standing on a mountainside with hard rocks under your feet. Looking out from this high place, the fog begins to clear, and you see before you a vast valley with starlight in the distance, a warm ocean, and many, many different creatures in the valley below you. You see forests, grasslands, swamps. All of your ancestors are below in that valley. We see Neolithic people. You can see small mammals, fish, things like salamanders. People working in the factories of the Industrial Revolution or in medieval Europe. Then you hear the din, the noise of their survival, the efforts that they have to survive, to give food, the love, the rivalries, the conflicts. There, you hear that one ancestor. When we look back and thought about the ancestors a minute ago, an ancestor came to your mind. It could have been perhaps someone in Spain, or maybe someone you've met, or even someone who's not a human. There, you hear that voice. You choose them to think, and they're lifted up and stand before you. Look at their face. Wouldn't it be incredible if across this gulf of space and time, you could actually thank them, express your gratitude for your life, for their life? Go ahead and take a few seconds to communicate that gratitude to them, if you like. And now you can see in their face that they did hear you. Imagine their feeling of pride and joy in thinking that someone in their future generations has taken the time to remember them, to thank them. Imagine their pride at seeing what you've become, what you can do, who you are. And now they have something to say to you too. To express that pride. Listen for a moment. And now say goodbye, even though you have millions more ancestors to thank. The fog begins to cover the valley again, and we move forward in time. As we move forward in time, we realize that we are not the end of this web of life. This web of life continues past 2014 into the future. The wind blows and the fog clears. We realize this mountain we're standing on is the hard, strong mountain of love, of effort, of struggle, of our ancestors, of this pulse of life, of this sacred fire that's been kept strong for so many years. The upper slopes begin to clear. We realize that we can look towards future generations. Some fog still lingers up there. We can't see the future as clearly as we can the past. But now we look up and we see the future generations ahead of us in the year 2030, 2080, and beyond. We think of those future generations. Perhaps we've met some of those people as children. Perhaps we just imagine them, where they might live, what they might be doing. It's quite possible that one of those two might take the time to thank an ancestor. We see one doing so. What is that person like? Look at who they are. Is it someone you've met? Or their grandchild? We realize that we are long gone. That we are in that valley of the ancestors that they're looking up on. And now we see that they've chosen us to thank. We feel ourselves lifted up and we stand before them. That member of the future generations thanks you for your life, for what you've done. Listen to what they're saying. Now you have a moment to express your love and gratitude to them if you choose. What would you say? What would you say to this person? Decades, centuries perhaps in the future. Go ahead and communicate that if you wish. And now we begin to return to the present. The fog increases again. Soon we feel the carpeting beneath our feet. This building becomes more real again. We are again surrounded by our community at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Midland. Welcome back. When I look to our history, to our universe, and to ourselves, I feel this immense wave of gratitude. The joy of what we have today. The joy that I feel at a family reunion. It reminds me of our first principle, of how valuable other people are. That they are all family members. And it also moves me to think about the future generations as well, in my actions. With that gratitude, with that power, I hope everyone here has a great day. Thank you, and blessed be.
From the great radiance, stars. From stardust, oceans. From crashing waves, life and death. From the struggle to survive, awareness. I am the dimly seeing, thinking universe. I hear my ancestors, who made me, who live in me. Together we call to future generations in whom we will live. Today, as before, we make their world.